Thank you, everyone, and it's lovely to hear from you. And apologies, I was running into different things, so I missed part of all your contributions. So I think for me, there's more questions for the department, and not for you, because you all have articulated so well that the challenges, to say the least, on this legislation, and the amount of work that we as a committee have to work to advocate for change on so many, because so many of those things, and and as Deputy Kearns has said in the previous contribution, we've all been told that this bill is the pathway to the protocol, and we have been pushing this and wanting this, and now I feel that we've got to a point that have we got ourselves on a bottleneck, because we're not particularly ready for everything, and Joe and has mentioned that people don't know what this is about. And I just have a question, and Alice, I have a few questions, and I suppose I apologise for the generality, because so many specific questions have been brought up, and I'm going to look over the entire debate later on in its entirety, listen to it to get a proper here, because coming in and out, you don't get the proper feel of the debate. But Alison, you mentioned the code of practices in your contribution. I believe it was you, and about the code of practice that would be needed. And the current decision of sports services have launched that public consultation, and on the draft code of practice that the regs that they've published, and this tight time frame for the public consultation, have they been just put it out on Twitter, put it out on the press release? Have they engaged with the people that this directly affects sufficiently enough that would say that there is going to be proper input and buy-in into all these code of practice? This is the code of practices is so crucial to get those right. And I absolutely agree with the review of a code of practice, because we know that things in a year down the road with things being implemented, things can always be improved. So I do agree with the review, but I just want to know on that, has there been enough done by the DSS? It's a very fancy website, it's very lovely, but is it accessible? Is it working for people who it's supposed to work for? And how can we advocate for that, even on a basic communication level between them and who it's supposed to be there? It's not there for us to go on and to get references and get the press releases and the latest news. It's there for people who need it, who need that support. I'll come back and we'll go into the next question, if that's okay.
Yeah. Thanks, Senator Allison.
Thanks, Senator McGreehan. So I might share my feedback with my colleague Teresa Mallon on this question, if that's okay, Chair.
Yeah, that's fine.
So I'll just briefly answer from my perspective, and I might also, I know that Teresa, as the chair of our assisted decision making reference group, has been very involved with ourselves in responding to the codes. So I suppose I'd say a number of things. One is that we have engaged with the Decision Support Service very recently, and have to say we're grateful for the response back and engaging very actively with the issues that we've been raising in relation to the codes. So we're glad about that. At a broader level, I suppose best practice is that people from whom this will be of very great importance need to be able to understand it. So in other consultation processes, we've seen the development of easy to read materials, and also not everybody even reads easy to read materials. So video explainers are great because you can pause a video, you can rewind a video, you can listen to it. So not everybody wants a visual. Some people like to listen, some people like to. So it's great if something of the importance of the codes of practice for people of varying different communication styles is possible for those people to understand. So I think what we'd love to see is that kind of accessible consultation. As Joe mentioned, not everybody has access to the internet, not everybody listens the same way, not everybody learns the same way. So Teresa, I might just get your input here as well, if that's okay.
Yeah, thanks, Alison. And thank you, Senator McGreehan. I suppose just to echo everything that Alison has said, I think that we believe that the accessibility of the process is really, really important. And I think we've heard from a number of witnesses this afternoon and people in terms who are coming to us with their lived experiences that they don't believe themselves and the people they represent, that there has been a really strong engagement with them in relation to the Act and the codes of practice. And I suppose, the accessibility piece is really, really important. And for us, I suppose, we use lots of different mediums in terms of how, as Alison, we communicate with people we support, so to ensure that it's really, really accessible. And I suppose it's really important that, the people we support is part of the process, which they haven't been to date, but also in terms of the people who are supporting them, the family members, who are key to this, to the, I suppose, the successful implementation of the ADM Act, their involvement in this whole process as well. So I think there's a learning in this. I think going forward, I know that there's a sense now, there's an urgency to get this over the line. And in fairness, the Act has real ability to strengthen the rights of people with disabilities in terms of supporting them with decisions. And I suppose, so it's a really powerful legislation. It may have its flaws, but it's powerful in the context of its focus on will and preference, moving away from a best interest approach. And it's decision specific and time specific. So there's a lot of really powerful components to the legislation. So I think that, the learning is that, as one of our speakers mentioned earlier on, nothing about us without us, that's the key learning here, that all the key stakeholders have involvement in these processes, feed into it, and it's accessible. Whilst we found it very challenging because of the codes were circulated so close to Christmas and all of that was happening there, we still had an opportunity to engage and to give some feedback to the process. So it's just to reiterate that.
Thanks. Burr, I see you have your hand up. Do you want to come in on this?
Yeah, thanks so much. Just very briefly, so it's section 103 of the bill that deals with the codes of practice, and there was 2 phases. So phase 1 opened, I think it was the end of November, and it closed on the 7th of January. There were 6 codes of practice in that section, and that was the one that Fiona referred to, the first one that had some examples of scenarios, and none of which referenced mental health difficulties. In this tranche of phase 2, where the deadline is this Friday, there are 8 codes of practice. So for decision-making assistants, co-decision makers, independent advocates, so, people that we're talking about today, family members, friends, carers, supporters, who might be in that decision support position. And just the other point on that is under, I know we all mentioned the UN CRPD, Articles 3 and 4 require the state to consult with people in the process of making policy. So not just given the accessible information afterwards, but that they're involved throughout the process. So that is a step that, and again, I know there's huge time constraints with everything and the Christmas period and that. So yeah, so I think, 14 codes overall, and they're very, very dense.
Okay. Senator McGreehan, have you other questions?
Yes, please, Chair, if that's possible. Yeah, thank you. I suppose this bill was meant to this innocent person here. I was hoping that this bill was going to be an answer to empowerment, and it actually could be a situation where people are in a way disempowered by lack of awareness and lack of, because they don't know what's going on and could fall through some cracks on it. And that brings me on to, I suppose, a question that I think, well, to John in Family Carers and to whoever who wanted to answer, and on those, because the state won't be ready with all the with the decision-making representative in place, and not have all those procedures and processes and family carers knowing what's their their rights, their obligations, individuals not knowing what their rights and obligations. What are the possible impacts on the individual, on healthcare? When there's a chance that for someone going into hospital, going to a bank, going somewhere and falling through a crack of bureaucracy of nobody really understanding what is each person's role in a decision-making process, whereas we know that the person who's to make the decision is they're a facilitator of a decision, not a decision maker. So what are the unintended consequences of not being prepared for this bill, and how people are going to be possibly disenfranchised and disempowered by people, organisations, healthcare workers, bank workers, whatever, not knowing where their rights and their obligations lie, and how it will impact on the individual who needs to make their decision.
There's a lot on that.
I was going to say there's quite a lot on that. First thing I'll say is I don't believe we're talking about unintended consequences. We're walking into this with our eyes wide open. So nobody need tell me in 6 months' time, oh, we didn't plan this or we didn't intend it. What can happen? Well, as I say, a light switch is thrown the day this legislation is commenced. And from that day forward, in a family situation where previously a profoundly disabled person was being looked after by their family and the family was looking after them, the law says that that person is their own person. Decisions may not be made for them. Their business may not be discussed with third parties, so with the parents. So we have been saying for a while, let's take one obvious area, medical. What's going to happen in a medical situation? And the answer we get is, you're not to worry about that, because the good news is there's a different bit of legislation which says if a doctor feels the need to do something, he can do it. He doesn't have to worry about capacity. So what we're basically saying is, well, okay, we take the family out of it. The doctor will act and actually will not be able, under GDPR kind of issues, to talk about the decisions he's making. So is that an improvement? Certainly not from a family carer's point of view. Because to add insult to injury, when the doctor's finished, that person's going back to the home to be looked after by the same family. The family who've been doing things over 18 years of learning how to do them with their loved ones, and all of a sudden they find they're now in a legal kind of through the looking glass world. They don't know what they can do and what they can't do. They don't know what falls within reasonable discretion. You know, if they give somebody cornflakes in the morning instead of Rice Krispies, is that abuse or is that reasonable? And the point is, they won't have any control over that. People make a complaint and the DSS will adjudicate. That's pretty much a nightmare situation for families. We're talking about the question of will and preference rather than best interest. But actually, on the medical front, it's the opposite. Will and preference goes out the door in favour of best interest, because the doctor, in this lacuna, until a decision-making representative is appointed, and even then, there's limits on what the decision-making representative can decide. So, in fact, the doctor swoops in with his overriding ability to diagnose a medical requirement and intervene with no restriction of any description. That's the kind of jumble we're looking at. From a family point of view, it is threatening, it is uncertain. I give you, it's more of a colour anecdote than anything else. So an adult gets a disability allowance. I'm aware of situations where they get their disability allowance, they go down to McDonald's, they eat their entire allowance in one sitting, they come home. They're sick, they're more than sick, it comes out of both ends, and who's left to clean up all of that? The family. The money from the disability allowance has been spent. The family has to pay for the food, the heat, the cleaning, the whatever else. So that's obviously not ideal. You'll be happy to hear that an advocacy group got involved and said, you know, this is not a good way to spend the money. The money should be spent on a bit of improvement. You know, by all means have some money for McDonald's, but really it's not a good idea to eat 200 euros worth of burgers at a time. So we'll take some of it and we'll spend it on training and helpful activities and all the rest, which, to be fair, was an improvement. But nobody actually stepped back and said, there's a family up the road who are feeding this guy, clothing him, cleaning him, whatever else him, and he's not making any contribution to it. So where does will and preference come into that? Is there something about the social contract around the family? If we're treating somebody as an equal person, surely they have responsibilities as well as entitlements and rights. And where that equation goes badly wrong, because I don't want to sound too whatever unreasonable about it, is in the family, because the family will never hold up, they'll never hold their loved one to hostage over the responsibilities. But the system only talking about will and preference is actually ignoring the fact that if you're in a social situation and if you're being treated as and acting like an adult, then that's a two-way street. So this is a thread that as you keep pulling it, as I say, I do think this is going to collapse under its own internal contradictions, largely because we're not preparing for it properly. I'm not saying it's impossible to do it. If you even go back to the question of not having guards on beds, because it's true. I've seen the situation in hospital where someone's quite distressed trying to climb over the side of the bed. They want to get out. Now, whether they need to or not, whether it's a good idea, we won't go there, but they're distressed about it, so fair enough. So maybe good idea not to have a barrier. In an institutional setting, you can achieve a certain economy of scale around managing that. If you want to do that in the home, of course you can do it. To do it requires a staff of 4 full-time carers in each home to roster 24-hour cover. Or is the expectation that the family carer, who, by the way, isn't the decision-making representative or whatever, this is just the family carer, well, they're there 24 hours a day. What's wrong with that? Why can't they keep an eye on somebody 24 hours a day? So I don't know if it's a good answer to your question, but it's a good question. I don't know where to begin answering it. I certainly don't know where to finish answering it, but there's some examples.
Thanks. Joe, you want to come in on this too?
To refer to something I said in my speech, the law causes trouble for people with disabilities who don't have good supports in their lives. Because if there's no good supports in a person's life, they're not going to trust the people that's going to be appointed by the judge or by whoever else, because they've been let down in the past. And then they could be sent to court making most basic decisions because they don't have good supports. People who live in institutions their whole lives and who don't have families around them are most at risk. I am also worried about families who, especially older family members, are used to the old way of making decisions on behalf of disabled persons in their lives. So we know they care about the person and love them, but family members want disabled people and aren't always in the same thing. Our rights to make our own decisions must be protected. And I'm also worried about family carers are asking for restraint to make made legal, but we want the law to say people with disabilities shouldn't be restrained. We have seen people abused in institutions and at home because resident is an everyday happening. Safeguards can, without restraint, no one should be allowed to use restraints in this way. Because you're going back to the old days when people were putting in straitjackets for basic things, and judges were making wrong decisions back in the older days when the Lunacy Act was in force. Thank you.
Thanks, Joe. Peter?
Hi, Erin. Good to see you. Yeah, the dangers that we fall back into a medical model responding to impairment labels. And not only professionals, but also family members as well. As Joe said, yes, I know the best interest and to do good. Sometimes that goes against the will and preference of today people. And also the issue around will and preference is that it's not something that you're gifted today. If I spent 20 years in a residential home, and suddenly today I have a nice council house in Sligo, which Sligo County Council's done some great work, and I have 3 or 4 hours PA service a day. Will I have the confidence and capacity to use that? That's in terms of social models that we recognise that it's not just about giving people random preference, there you go. It's about capacity building that, and we have a really good relationship with the community development sector, like in Sligo, the community centres. So that's where capacity building happens. We can take people away from family members, away from the disability sector, but it's a long process. But it does actually work. And again, I know I keep beating the same drum, but GPOs have that experience of doing that. So it's not a blank sheet. It's not blank canvas. We do have the experience of working with like myself. I'm managing a team. We're working with 600 people, 600 disabled adults in the last 2 years. So we've shown that through a very simple training program, IT program, with the local DPOs, disabled people can appreciate the capacity building nature of women preference. It's not something that happens overnight, but it is doable. Yeah. Thanks.
Thanks, Peter.
Just very briefly, Chair, if just on that, just to follow up on Peter, and I wanted just to ask him, it's lovely to see you again, but if we don't actually facilitate and really work on this will and preference attitude as opposed to the best interest, are we in danger of actually legislating for a medical model as opposed to the social model if we're not actually putting this out front and centre, that it's the will and preference and not best interest, it's the will and preference? Are we in danger of putting a wrapping medical model in something that we're trying to get away from?
Because the medical model is so inherent, it's so big, that it's so easy to fall back into impairment label analysis and identifying individuals with their impairment label baggage. So that's a big danger as well. That's only when preference. It's that idea of recognising class, gender, ethnic background. So they're very important intersectional elements that you are working class one who spent 20 years in an institution. Where do you get the confidence to really appreciate that will and preference? And also in terms of I know in National Altruism Service on the board there, you come across institutions and family members talking about non-verbal communication. it's not no very. It's just a different type of communication. And in my own experience, I have to say, and with the National Office here, the start there, I haven't come across any cases. I've been working in this area for 30 years. Any cases where you can't find that point of communication and build that winning preference. So it takes me time, not a lot of time, actually, be surprised how quick it happens. But it's a winning preference also to identify that it has a capacity building nature and framework behind it. That is not just here you go. You know, you have to within preference go for it. There's a need to recognise that disabled adults have to have the capacity building to make that within preference effective.